Welcome to Season 5 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 5, we'll be talking with Zula Rabikowska about working with communities. Zula is a London-based, Polish, queer visual artist. Zula was born in London and grew up in the UK, and her documentary practice is influenced by her own experience of migration. Zula draws a lot of her creative inspiration from her upbringing and heritage, and her work explores themes of displacement, gender identity, and LGBTQI+ communities. Her photographs seek to offer a space for conversation and community building. Among others, Zula is a recipient of the Center for British Photography Realization Grant, Mead Fellowship, and Getty Images Award, and her work has been published and exhibited internationally, including in The Guardian, the BJP, Times, and the BBC. Zula also works as a writer and photography lecturer at Kingston University in London. Can we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
So I am a Polish queer documentary photographer, but also a visual artist, as I work with photography as well as videography and sometimes archival documents of photographs, testimonies. And in my most recent project, I also created a sculpture. So I let the story kind of direct how it wants to be told.
That's super interesting. So I guess can you maybe talk a little bit about how you got into photography? And because I think that sort of bringing in sculpture and bringing in like other modes of storytelling is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually a career changer. And what brought me into photography is storytelling. So my BA and what I studied at university was English and French. So literature and the stories of other people. I used to teach English as a foreign language around the world. I also worked in finance for a bit and operations management. And to my surprise, all of those skills actually come handy when you work as a freelance photographer. But it was the storytelling and that element, connecting with people, working with communities, that really encouraged me to pursue a career in photography. Some years ago, I did a master's degree at the London College of Communication in documentary photography. And I would say that very much marked the starting point of my career in photography.
That's really interesting. And was ethics sort of a part of that learning, or how have you developed sort of your own ethical approach in your work?
So ethics, I would say, is really integral to my way of working. I'm really inspired by the theory of inside, outside, and I always ask myself, particularly when working on personal projects, what is my relation to the subject that I am documenting? It's different when I work commercially or editorially because there are other kind of teams and sometimes clients involved. But when documenting communities, normally these themes stem from me and my lived experience. So to give you an example, some of the projects that I've carried out in the recent years have covered my own experience as a Polish immigrant living in London. I moved to Poland when I was 10. I didn't speak any English, and kind of that duality of identity comes through my work. So I work often with my own family, whether those living in the UK or that are still in Poland, and often explore topics of Eastern Europe and the former Eastern Bloc and communities still living in those regions. I am also part of the LGBTQI+ community. And a lot of my projects engage with queerness and queer identity and gender identity. So I see myself as being within those communities. In the past, I've also worked on another topic which documented the Vietnamese diaspora in Poland. So even though I am Polish, I'm not part of the Vietnamese community. And when carrying out that work, I worked really collaboratively, and I encouraged and worked in a way where the project participants chose where they wanted to be photographed and how their story was told.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important and interesting point, that like the different ways that we can educate ourselves when we are not part of a community, right? Because I guess we've got to do a lot more legwork and research. I mean, I guess if we're doing work about ourselves, we also have a lot of research to do, but it's sort of that added effort, I think, and that added care that it takes when we're photographing communities that we're not part of. Does that resonate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even when working on personal topics, even when I was working with my mum or my sister, or when I interviewed myself for one of my short films, I would say in 99% of cases, my projects start with research, whether it's secondary research and reading material that's already out there, consulting visual material that's out there, or primary research, which I carry out through interviews and gather the information which then influences my work. I think it's really important to be informed and use that as a starting point.
It's something that we've sort of talked about on a few episodes of the Photo Ethics podcast, but that I think is really challenging terrain is documenting yourself and your family. How have you approached that?
So it was really interesting. As I mentioned, it was storytelling that brought me to photography. And before I started the MA at LCC, I was really interested in the stories of others. I used to live in China and the French Caribbean, and I was always pointing my lens outwards. And when I did the MA, I was exposed to a lot of new theories, which have shaped me, on a personal level, but also a professional level as a visual storyteller, which we already mentioned about, working inside and outside. And that was the moment when I thought, hold on, what if I told my own story? I never considered that to be of interest to anybody else. And what was said to me is the stories that the most personal end up being the most universal. And I often go back to that and let that, when I get stuck or if I'm working on a new idea, I let that carry me through and it influenced the way that I work.
I think that really resonates with me as well. That like, I think sometimes we think about like, well, who's going to care about our own story? Or it feels kind of like navel gazing. I've got this like perpetual fear of being navel gazing in my work. But I think, you're absolutely right that like, actually there's a lot that everybody could learn from these things.
What's really interesting is, as I've mentioned, I've moved to the UK when I was 10. I'm now in my 30s, and I always do feel like I'm an in-betweener. I'm not really Polish enough when I'm in Poland, and I'm not really British enough when I'm in the UK. And that's something that I experience, but also the society externally seems to want to highlight that to me, whether it's peers or sometimes people who I meet at events, they'll tell me, what's your accent about? You don't really sound Polish, or you don't really look Polish. And in 2020, in between the COVID waves, I moved back to Poland. So I did the reversal migration journey. And I moved back to Poland, kind of feeling a bit dissuaded with the life in the UK and kind of constantly being reminded that I'm an immigrant. And in Poland, I wasn't Polish enough either for my family or my friends or my peers. So I would say most of the time that in-betweenness kind of occupying or having this space of intersection, I value greatly. And I think it's really influential in my work. But sometimes it's quite tough when society around you reminds you that you're not enough of either thing.
There is something, I think, about people that there is often a focus on what's different, and I don't know, being originally from the United States and living in Northern Ireland, like I swear every time I meet somebody, there's a conversation about my accent. And every time, there's always that, and you can't kind of just exist sometimes, I think, in new spaces when you're an immigrant. And I don't know, I'm sure that's heightened for you when there's also a language element, so that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would actually say that working visually helps me process often those emotions. So my first time I worked in a really personal way, whilst at the MA, I did a multimedia project called Citizens of Nowhere, where I interviewed my mum and my sister and myself about our experience of immigrant life in the UK and used an analog camera and then ended up soaking the film rolls in salt water from the English Channel to mimic this idea of erosion that takes place as you assimilate into a new culture. So I ended up with these streaky images, which then I used to create a multimedia piece. And it was this whole idea of it being so personal. It was very emotional for all of us to talk about our experience because we've never done that before. So I almost used the camera and the project like an excuse to explore those feelings and issues. And I created a multimedia piece, and it got really picked up by a lot of awards and exhibitions and festivals, and I received messages from people who experienced migration, whether directly or indirectly through their families, could somehow connect and relate to this idea of being in between places. And that then gave me the confidence to work with my family more. So I think that was the first time I worked in such a way. And since then, it's been really important in my practice.
And how did your family feel about sort of being under your lens?
My mum and my sister, it was the first time, and they were really responsive and kind of just wanted to help me. And I recently was showing this film at the Photo Book Cafe in London as part of a larger exhibition I curated, which was called Rethinking Eastern Europe. So there were other artists showing their work as well. And my mum came along and she was crying. Watching that film back, even it was 5-6 years ago now that I've made it. So I think it's still an emotional topic for her. And since then, I've been interviewing them and photographing them on a regular basis. But apart from my mum and my sister, all of my family still live in Poland, and most of them don't speak English. I really love working with my granddad, who is in his 80s. I've made a short film with him, which was recently shortlisted for the Earth photo, about borders that run through the village where I'm from. It's a village of 200 people. And initially, when I started working with older generations of my family who experienced communism and kind of really dictatorial regimes, they were scared. There was a lot of fear in discussing their own experiences. They were worried for themselves, but they were worried also how it could impact me. But over time, that has lessened. And now most of them are really willing to share their stories. And I think, if anything, feel excited and flattered that I can bring that to a more international audience. I think they're also surprised that people are interested in their experiences the same way that I was surprised the first time I worked in a personal way. But it's a really nice ongoing collaboration. And I'm actually going back to Poland again this summer. I try to go at least once a year, if not more. And we'll probably create another project with some members of my family.
I think it's really interesting that you said that they were worried not just for themselves, but for you. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
I think, especially when I started, not all of them were super comfortable. I'm talking about the older generations, were comfortable with the internet, and they didn't quite understand what that could mean for me if suddenly they were sharing stories that were criticizing political regimes or the government or history. They thought that might impact me. And I mean, even now, Poland has an ongoing struggle problem. Something that it's facing is censorship. So when I lived there in 2020 and the summer after that, so there was the Krakow Photo Month, which is an international photography festival. In 2021, there was the festival with loads of different international artists showing their work. And there was one collective exhibition which was meant to show the work of artists documenting protests against the abortion ban that has been happening and was kind of introduced. So a lot of artists were protesting that, and that exhibition was shut down by the police before it even opened. And then some artists ended up pulling out from that in response to the censorship. When I was living there, we were always protesting regarding different things. So I think that fear that my granddad or other members of my family had is but partially reasonable, because that challenge is still there, and it's very different making work whilst you're living in Poland versus somewhere like in the UK. I can't really compare it to to many other places, as that's the two countries that I'm most comfortable discussing. But I experienced it firsthand, and I couldn't quite believe that an art exhibition was shut down by the police.
Absolutely. Do you feel that there is a risk that you need to manage for your family when you're creating work?
No, I don't think so, as that was very, very specific. I wasn't involved in exhibiting the work myself. It was about the abortion ban, and I was working and covering that in a more photojournalistic manner, which was published by international media. But in terms of the safety of my family, when we do work together, they either talk about their experience of, World War II, with the case of my granddad when he was a child, which many other artists are doing. We have also made a film about Auschwitz with him in the past, but I don't feel there is an element of kind of danger for them. Similarly, for my mum and my sister here, I don't think there's kind of any questions regarding their personal safety when working together. But these are the questions that I am having to ask myself on a regular basis when working collaboratively like that.
And I guess, is sort of safety an issue or a consideration when it comes to the work that you've done on photographing members of the queer community?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in 2021, I did it's my biggest project to date. It's about gender identity and womanhood in Eastern Europe, or the former communist countries. So I spent about a year and a half researching, applying for funding, and then set off for this huge journey where I traveled for almost 5,000 miles across the former Iron Curtain border between the East and the West. And I interviewed and photographed 104 people about their experience of gender and womanhood. So when I was working in that way, I was traveling by public transport, I was traveling on my own, and there were a lot of questions regarding my personal safety. People came up to me on a regular basis, if I was just sat in a cafe or a bar on my own, taking notes or recording, and they would ask, what are you doing? Who are you waiting for? Where's your husband? Where are your children? Or if I was getting a taxi from the airport, there would constantly be questions, why are you on your own? And these are the questions of safety, obviously, as women, that we have to think about anyway on a unfortunately regular basis when walking home in the dark. But they were very much heightened for me when I was working on that project. For example, when I was in Romania, I was interviewing young women and non-binary people there. Romania has one of the highest number in Europe of missing girls. So, as a small perceived female, I was constantly worried about my safety, if not constantly being in this state of anxiety, whether something was going to happen to me. And I did have just an uncomfortable situation on the border, but nothing luckily did happen. But the question of safety is something that I'm thinking about all the time personally. I have recently also, last year and this year, completed two projects, one about queer Muslim communities in England and the other one about queer parenthood. And with the one about queer Muslim communities, it was actually an assignment, a commission. But when that kind of was put in place, a lot of the reaction I received was people who are not part of either of these communities were asking me, is it safe for these people to, vocalize their story? And a lot of the people that I worked with are actually activists and are super open about their experiences, have their own blogs and podcasts, if not influencers, where they discuss their experiences. From my understanding, it's different in other areas or other communities, but that was really important to show that these voices do exist. I'm always really transparent when working with other people, and ideally have it in writing to say, I'm a working visual artist or photographer. This work will be published. It will be made public. It will be exhibited. So people at any point actually have the option to say, I'm not comfortable with this, or, can we do it differently? It's happened a couple of times to me where people choose to be anonymous, when I was working on the project about gender identity, there was one participant who, due to the quite high standing of her family, like socially, wanted to use an alias and be photographed anonymously. Similarly with the queer parenthood project recently, I had one participant who really didn't want to reveal who they were. So that's something that I obviously respect. And by having those conversations and being really upfront about my intentions, I think then helps me work in a more directed and ethical way.
Absolutely. And if you had any advice for someone who was wanting to start a project photographing people in a community, either that they're a part of or that they're not a part of, like, how would you advise them to approach that, especially when it comes to things like, you know, having those conversations and being really transparent and understanding what their needs are or concerns are? Like, what advice would you give?
If they haven't already, to start off by reading Susan Sontag regarding pain of others is a really great starting point, but also to consider what their position is in relation to the community. I mean, I still see every year global awards which are awarded clearly to photographers who are not parts of the community. And there's a whole discussion going on, you know, should that person photograph a community that they're not part of? It was particularly frustrating to see when the war in Ukraine started. I came across an article, top 10 photojournalists to follow, covering the conflict. And they were all, you know, Anglophone from the US or the UK. And I was just thinking, wow, this is obviously a few years ago. Like, wow, this is such a big thing. Why not get more local photographers? So I think it's important to ask yourself these questions. I also do think there are a lot of photojournalists that go into conflict and war zones and tell very important stories that need to be told. So I also do recognize that. But I think if you're working in a slower way that's not linked to a war zone and kind of covering those areas, it's important to be aware what your relationship with the person is. Be explicit and direct what your intentions are. You know, are you a student and is this a student project and you're not actually going to show it to anyone else? Or are you going to use it commercially? Or do you have a secret intention? So I think it's really important to have those discussions and use consent forms. Sometimes I know photographers find them really awkward to use, but I actually find having a consent form a space for a dialogue. So the person understands, especially if, you know, maybe English is not their first language, to really see and think about what it is that they're agreeing to. And in terms of like practical stuff, it's about having the participant comfortable with you. So I predominantly, when I work in a documentary way, photograph or film people who are not used to being in front of a camera, and they don't know how to hold themselves and how to look. And obviously, apart from giving practical advice on, you know, not blink and where to stand, I think it's really important to ensure that the person is feeling comfortable with you and vulnerable. So often when I carry out interviews and photograph people, I like to leave myself a good amount of time and not rush through, and start off these sessions by sharing something about myself and my journey and kind of making myself vulnerable and giving the other person access to my story and some of my details, which then creates this safe space for them to share the things that they want to share about their experience and their story. Obviously, it's not the only way to work. This is just something that I've been kind of implementing, and I'm still learning as I go, and I keep making adjustments depending on the kind of projects that I'm working on.
Absolutely. Like, there's a huge element of time there, you know, and taking time, which I think is really important. But there's something else that I thought was quite interesting that you said, is that, you know, making sure that you're being vulnerable and that they feel able to be vulnerable. And I think sometimes we think of vulnerability as being like a negative thing, or that for somebody to be vulnerable in your presence as a photographer, that's a negative thing. It sounds to me that you're sort of like flipping vulnerability on its head a little bit in a way.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think it's about creating a space where a story can be shared to give you an example, like when working with my granddad, he finds it really difficult to talk about some of the atrocities that he has witnessed. And sometimes it's those situations don't require my input, but it's about creating an atmosphere or finding the right time of day or week, or even season where that story can be told. So I think vulnerability is multidimensional, and there are definitely elements of safety and security, but often the visual, I guess, images that come, at least in my mind, when I hear vulnerability are, maybe even children, and kind of having that safe space to share and to be themselves. And there is not enough of that in society, in my opinion. As often we are required to carry a mask and sometimes protect our experiences. And sometimes it's important to protect these stories or experiences and share them in the right time, as they might be triggering for other people. So that's what I mean when I think about creating this vulnerable space. I mean, for me, when I interviewed 104 people, it was very intense, as some of the stories were very harrowing and difficult to hear. So, for me also, that was quite a lot to process. And then I had to ensure when I came back and finished the project, I left myself enough time to process and also protect myself a little bit. Also to do those stories justice and tell them in the best way possible.
Absolutely. And in creating the different projects or working on the different projects that you've done, have you encountered any ethical dilemmas that you could maybe tell us about, and tell us about how you negotiated that?
Yeah, all the time. When I was carrying out my big documentary project about gender identity, I actually fell in love with one of my project participants, which was completely unexpected. It happened when I was in Estonia. I met her. I carried out the interview, and after a while, we figured out we felt the same way. So it was kind of negotiating that space of someone sharing their story and wanting to be in their project, and then becoming part of my life, and they are no longer part of my life. So kind of constantly negotiating that space and figuring out what is appropriate. Another question that comes up regarding ethics quite a lot for me, underage participants. So I had a few of those when carrying out the project, but it was actually their parents who contacted me and asked me to include their kids or their children in the project, but I had to get the right parental consent. I think there were 16 on top of my head, or 17, to share their stories. And generally, a personal policy I have is, unless I'm photographing like a parent or a guardian of the kids, I try not to include children or minors in my projects, because that's kind of the stance that I have. I know other photographers and artists approach that differently. So I think for me, these are the most frequent questions or concerns that arise when thinking about ethics.
Absolutely. And to your first ethical dilemma that you shared, absolutely, like photographers are people too, right?
Yeah.
So we do have, and sometimes it's as involved as, having a romantic connection with a person that we're working with, but sometimes it's as simple as just developing a friendship with somebody that we're working with, and the lines can get blurry about, well, how do I negotiate consent, or how do I get access, or how do I involve this person in a project in a way that's still ethically on the up? I think that, we have human relationships with the people around us. And I think to try to hide that or pretend that we can completely be a fly on the wall and not be affected or not have connections with people is disingenuous. So I appreciate your sharing that. So I know that you, as part of your practice, you create work, but you also are an educator. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that experience of being an educator, and maybe how do you approach ethics in education as well?
Yes, it's really interesting. I actually teach on a graphic design BA in London, and within that, the students, I work predominantly with second year students, so very young adults who choose an image path, image in the sense of photography or video, but also camera-less techniques such as cyanotypes or pinhole cameras. So I would say half of it are very practical skills where we cover how to use a camera and shutter speed. But there is a whole focus on ethics and working with communities and working with other people. And who are you to tell this story? Every year when we start off by having a portraiture assignment, and I know this happens in other academic institutions and not just with me, there's a whole bunch of students that just want to photograph people who experience homelessness. And I, as an educator, kind of have I don't want to use the word ban, but a stance that I would really like them to avoid that and think about what does it mean to experience that, and who are you as a student from a particular background to go off and point a camera in someone's face who's in a really vulnerable, precarious situation and exploit that for your personal gain. So we often have discussions with students about that and how to navigate through that and talk to each other, but also refer them to other photographers, other artists, theory, who explore those issues.
Yeah, I think that can be a bit of a tricky one, can't it? That, trying to steer away, don't want to quelch their interest or enthusiasm. But yeah, I mean, I think it is very, very tricky to tell a news story about the experience of homelessness that's done very well, especially when people are so early in their career that maybe they haven't developed the techniques or the approach yet to really handle that with the care that it needs.
Absolutely. I do think it's a very important topic. I just think there are, whether they're techniques or this sensitivity, whether that comes through lived experience or awareness or a collaboration. I mean, they're fantastic visual artists that do this work very well. Anthony Luvera has been working on this topic for a long time, which, is a really wonderful example of citing someone who does this, in my opinion, very well. But sometimes when I have students who haven't held a camera before and they want to take a portrait, they don't quite know what to do. So I try to steer them in a different direction.
Yeah, and it's a lovely plug just to say that we do have an episode as well with Anthony Luvera. So if anybody's interested in hearing more about that, he gave an interview. I think it was season 1. So just a wee redirection there for anybody who would like to follow that up. Is there anything else that I should have asked but didn't?
I can just add that aside from creating work and working in higher education, I have recently kind of started to exploring a curatorial element to my practice. So I have recently curated my first show in London, which brought together 18 different artists exploring the topic of Eastern Europe, and we focused on rethinking Eastern Europe. And I also write about photography, so working across different mediums, I think, to bring different or a variety of topics to different audiences. And I'm hoping to then take this exhibition. There's been quite a lot of interest. It kind of has snowballed to the photo festival in Arles in France. But I think that's probably the last thing I have to add.
That's brilliant. And one thing that I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
So many things. I think for me, photography ethics means an ongoing process of negotiation with yourself, but also with the topic or subject that you are documenting. So being informed, whether that's through personal experience, but also through factual or emotional understanding of the topic through other people or through reading or gathering information. I think I would say that's definitely what photography ethics would mean to me, is a process. So it's not something that you learn once and then it's over. I think it's something that's ongoing, that you have to adapt depending on the situation and the community or the person that you're working with. And also the times, the world is changing with different conflicts, wars, but also technologies such as AI, which we haven't touched on, which, could be a whole podcast on itself about ethics of that. So there are different currents within visual media and also visual literacy that are emerging. So I think ethics for me is definitely a process, an ongoing process.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So, if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Join me next week when we hear from Nicole Tung on navigating ethical dilemmas. In each episode of the podcast, we ask our guests, what does photography ethics mean to you? This is a question that everyone in the photography industry should be able to answer. That's why the Photography Ethics Center is asking you, our listeners, to commit to writing and publishing your own statement of ethics. Visit www.photoethics.org/ethics to learn more and to take the pledge committing to ethical transparency, accountability, and awareness. That's www.photoethics.org/ethics.